commenced Phase 1b trials for its lead drug candidate, TRP-8803, in June last year at the CMAX Clinical Research Laboratory, with confirmation of key safety parameters subsequently confirmed by the Safety Review Council in October. Additional dosing was then quickly completed with an expanded obese volunteer cohort. To discuss this further, I'm joined by CMAX Consultant Medical Director, Professor Sepehr Shakib. Professor, welcome to InvestorStream. Can you just take us through the psilocin IV infusion therapy itself and whether or not you gained any feedback from subjects after dosing regarding their thoughts on treatment?
Yeah, so the whole study went really, really well. We're very, very excited about the way the study was conducted as well as the results that we saw. The intravenous infusion is that of magic mushroom ingredient, which is psilocybin, and in the body that's then converted to the active ingredient. So here what we're able to do is just to intravenously infuse the active ingredient. And the way that's done is that a larger dose is given to begin with in order to take the participant very quickly into the psychedelic state. And then they're given a longer, slower infusion to maintain that psychedelic state. And I guess what was really exciting about what we saw was that everything pretty much worked the way that we would expect. So participants were able to get into the psychedelic state within about the first 10 minutes or so. And part of the concern about giving participants psychedelic treatment is that in that initial period, they can have nausea and the sense of anxiety because of, what they're seeing and experiencing and that loss of self. Because of the fact that this was an intravenous infusion and the psychedelic state occurred so quickly, we didn't really see a lot of distress by the participants in that initial period. Understandably, we had some participants with nausea. We had others with fairly typical side effects such as flushing or feeling hot. But certainly none of the participants wanted to stop the treatment. It was all went very, very smoothly from that point of view. And so within just a few minutes of starting the infusion, they were reporting very high scores that they reported for their psychedelic state. And then very importantly, by continuing that infusion for the first 20 minutes or so, and then having a slower rate over a much longer period of time, they were able to consistently maintain that psychedelic state. And that was really what the results were that we wanted to see with the infusion of this study drug. And so from that point of view, it was a very, very successful study, and we're very, very pleased with the results that we saw.
Now, Professor Shakib, you've been involved with a number of studies that treated patients with oral psilocybin. What is your impression of IV-infused psilocin compared to oral psilocybin?
I think they're both two quite separate treatments. They have different roles. So obviously with oral psilocybin, it's quite easy to administer, but as usually occurs with oral medications, what we find is there's a bit of variability in terms of how much of the drug makes it into the bloodstream, the sort of concentrations you achieve, as well as how long it takes for participants to start to have a psychedelic effect. And then as it gets into the bloodstream and hangs around for a little while, then there's a period of time that it's still being absorbed while the effect is wearing off. And so we tend to see this longer period of time that participants report the psychedelic experience. And that clearly has a role and is very, very useful for a lot of individuals. What we saw with the intravenous dosing was because of the initial bolus that's given, participants are able to get into the psychedelic state quite quickly, so much more rapidly than would normally occur with the oral dosing. That again occurred quite reliably in quite a number of the participants, and were then able to maintain that psychedelic state whilst the infusion was going on. The other advantage we had is that as soon as the infusion was then turned off, participants reported a fairly rapid fall in what they reported as their psychedelic scores. And so what it means is it then provides the practitioner with a lot of control. And so if the participant is having any nasty adverse effects or experiences that's particularly uncomfortable for them, it's easy enough to turn the infusion off and then the symptoms settle quite quickly. If, on the other hand, the practitioner needs the therapy session to go on for a longer period of time, you can just keep the infusion going. And also there's less waiting time in terms of waiting for the participant to get into that psychedelic state. The whole process, it's more invasive, and it requires the intravenous infusion, but there's just a lot more control because we're actually administering the active drug straight into the vein, which then gets sent to the body in a much more controlled way.
Okay, so based on your experience in this field, do the consistent results observed from the study across an obese and non-obese patient cohort provide a positive indication for the future reproducibility of the drug treatment?
Yeah, so certainly what we've seen is, as mentioned earlier, a very reliable way of being able to get participants into the psychedelic state. Our study included participants whose body mass index was about 20 or 30, as well as those with a higher body mass index. And those things do result in changes in the pharmacology of the drug. But what we found across the different doses we gave, as well as across different participants and their sizes, was that, again, reliably, within about 10 minutes or so, they were able to get into the psychedelic state. They were able to maintain a steady psychedelic experience. Understandably, with any drug that acts on the brain, there's a bit of variability between different individuals. So some individuals report their scores as a 10 and others report as a 6. You would expect that. But certainly all participants were able to report they got into the psychedelic state, and that was maintained for a period of time, regardless of whether they were a younger participant or an older participant or someone who was smaller or larger. And certainly what that means is that as the company decides to go into different patient populations, and as you can appreciate across the mental health population, there'll be a huge variety of different individuals, different ages, different experiences, different sizes, then we've got reasonable data at this stage to suggest that with the doses that we've trialed, you'll be able to get a fairly consistent psychedelic experience. So it's probably going to be less trial and error in terms of the doses that you need for different individuals, and a lot more reliable dosing at an effective psychedelic dose.
Now, TRP-8803 and other similar compounds have the potential to deliver neuroplastic benefits to achieve improved health outcomes. For viewers new to this field of medicine, can you provide a quick overview of neuroplasticity and why is it such an interesting area of health science?
You can talk about neuroplasticity and the biological aspects of it, extensively. From the mental health point of view, I like to sort of think of it this way. This is the way I explain it to participants. So imagine, for example, that you have an underlying severe mental health disorder. So you may have treatment-resistant depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. And so what you tend to find is that there's just repetitive thoughts you tend to have, particularly ways you tend to think about things. Or, for example, there's underlying eating disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder. Again, what you tend to do is to have the same repetitive thought process. So, for example, the need to wash your hands with obsessive compulsive disorder. A lot of the times, the best treatment for these conditions is pharmacotherapy as well as psychological therapy. What a lot of the psychological therapy is trying to do is to try and get into the underlying reason why these individuals are thinking about things the way they are. And cognitive behavioral therapy that works particularly well. Fundamentally with that, what we're trying to do is to try and get the participant to think about the thoughts they're having and trying to change that. The reason why a lot of times these treatments don't work, though, is because as soon as you start to think about why something is dirty and why you need to wash your hands, or you start to think about the post-traumatic experience and try to think about that differently so that you can then change your thoughts and reduce the symptoms, then the experiences that individuals have at those times can be so severe that their ability to think about it just shuts down. So the deeper parts of our brain that try and protect us from anxiety, from external stresses, they tend to shut down the thinking. And so despite the fact that individuals are in therapy for a long period of time, the psychologist is repeatedly trying to engage them in discussions about thinking about things differently. Your hands really aren't dirty. You're not really overweight. And trying to, you're not hopeless and everything isn't hopeless. Try to change the way that people think about things. Unfortunately, what happens is that people come across this barrier. What psychological therapy associated with psychedelics can provide is that there's flexibility in that thinking. So now, under the influence of the psychedelic, your mind is expanded in terms of the psychedelic experience, but it's also expanded in terms of how you can think about the difficulties you're having. So if the question is about whether you're feeling hopeless in life and you're of no worth, you can expand how you can look at that in ways that we couldn't do it before just by talking with a psychologist. If the issue is around everything being dirty and the fact that you have to wash your hands, people become more open to the idea of looking at that differently. And again, in situations to do with post-traumatic stress disorder and with eating disorders and things, the regular challenges and the regular struggles that different people have had in terms of how they think about things. People find that under the influence of psychedelic medications, that they have a different way, they're more open to the idea of how those issues can be thought about differently. And fundamentally in the mental health space, this is really what neuroplasticity is about. What it means is that the struggles that people have had with a particular way of thinking because of adverse experiences they've had before in childhood and other sort of things, these regular ways of thinking and regular blocks and barriers they've had, the psychedelic therapy can help change the way they think and potentially change those blocks. And they can then start to think about things in novel ways they've never thought about it before. And that can then be helpful in terms of then trying to resolve a lot of the underlying issues with their mental health disorders, so that we can start to find that they start to get into the underlying issue of their anxieties, of the post-traumatic stress, the underlying reasons, if there are some, for eating disorders and obsessive compulsive therapy disorder. So this is really the revolutionary approach that the psychedelic associated psychotherapy can offer, is in terms of changing how people are able to think and approach problems. And I guess what we then tend to call that is neuroplasticity. There's a lot of biochemical and other changes in the brain in terms of genes turning on and off. But fundamentally, when it comes to the mental health space, then these are really the benefits that we hope to see for our patients.
And just finally, would you be able to educate investors on the role that CMAX plays in Australia's clinical health sector, and why was it best suited for Tryp's phase 1B study?
Yeah, so CMAX Clinical Research is Australia's oldest phase 1 clinical trial facility. So when we talk about clinical trials, we're looking at the early phases, which is where CMAX is involved in. And so that's taking drugs that have never been given to human beings before, so previously been given to animals, and administering to human beings for the first time in a way that's safe, that protects the participants, but also provides very, very useful data for pharmaceutical companies and sponsors to then be able to take that compound and then be able to give it to patients for the first time. And those studies are what we call in phase 2 and phase 3 studies. And CMAX is involved in this early part. And so we have a lot of expertise. We've been around for 30 years now in terms of doing these type of studies, involved in probably over 1,000 studies. The studies that we've done at CMAX have been subsequently approved through the Australian Therapeutic Goods Administration, but also the American Food and Drug Administration, European Medicines Evaluation Association, etc. So the work that's done here at CMAX Clinical Research is of sufficiently high quality that it's accepted by overseas regulatory bodies, and that's very, very exciting. And in fact, a lot of the sponsors, a lot of the work actually comes from overseas. They seek us out from America and China and elsewhere because the quality of the work that's provided. At the moment, CMAX has about 78 beds, so has a large facility, employs about 350 staff, and so has a lot of capacity to be able to do a wide variety of different work. And particularly what we specialize in is those difficult, unusual studies that can't be done by anybody else. So the team at CMAX particularly specializes in being able to meet the sponsor's needs in things that are unusual, such as psychedelics or studies that involve specialist procedures, because our aim is to meet the sponsor's needs and to do things and go above and beyond where other people aren't able to do that. So in the psychedelic space, we see ourselves as the leader in psychedelic trials, not just in Australia, but pretty much in the Southern Hemisphere. And we have a unique facility. We have some specialized spaces, which are these low acuity rooms. These are very, very quiet spaces, which have got particular infrastructure. And what this allows us to do is to be able to create a very quiet, relaxed, non-clinical space for the participants. We have beds and couches and wall hangings and almost lava lamps and that sort of thing to create a very friendly, familiar, comfortable environment for participants to have a psychedelic experiencing, at the same time as having the really critical resuscitation equipment and other things that we might need nearby, fully staffed with experts such as myself in the areas of pharmacology as well as drug development. But we also have a suite of psychologists that we can use to be able to provide support for the participants as well as the sponsors when it comes to collecting some of the really, really special and particularly highly specialized assessments they need to do. So both in terms of the infrastructure, as well as the staff, as well as the attitude of wanting to do things that other people can't, I think the CMAX is really uniquely situated in the very early phase clinical trial space, particularly when it comes to psychedelic drugs.
Thanks, Professor. Really appreciate the insights. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.